ACDC decided, after Bon Scott's death, that they were going to bring in a new man, I think they faced the inevitable dilemma any band always faces when they try and replace a vocalist. Any successful band face, which is, do you go for someone in a similar mould and run the risk, therefore, of this person living in the shadow of their predecessor, or do you go for someone completely different and run the risk of taking the band in such a different direction the diehards don't really understand or appreciate it? Now, ACDC actually, from what I understand, came down to a short list of about 4 different vocalists from whom they chose the final man. There was Steve Wright, who'd been in a band called the Easy Beats. I think his problem was that he was in the band with Harry Vanda and George Young, the producers of DC in their early days, and perhaps a little bit too close to home. Gary Holton of the Heavy Metal Kids was another one who was very much in the frame. Later went on to find fame with Auf Wiedersehen Pet, the TV sitcom, before sadly dying. His problem was too much of a personality, too much of a larger-than-life character, ergo Bon Scott. Another one was a guy called Alan Fryer from Heaven, an Australian band, quite a moderately successful Australian band, who featured at one point Mark Evans, the original AC/DC bassist. And the fourth choice was Brian Johnson.
Brian Johnson was the ideal choice as the replacement to Bon Scott. His credentials were, he'd come from a band called Geordie, who hadn't really got anywhere. But they also had been, I think their career had kind of stalled up to that point.
Nowadays people sort of say, oh yes, you know, the ex-Geordie singer. It's like, well, quite frankly, in 1980, when Bon Scott died, no one knew who the hell Geordie were.
Well, Brian Johnson was very much an unknown before he joined ACDC, although the most bizarre element of it is that Bon Scott actually recommended him to the other members of ACDC. At some point in the late 70s, he'd been to see Brian's old band Geordie, and Bon had, and saw a gig where Brian was rolling around on the floor screaming his head off, and he came back raving to the rest of AC/DC saying, if ever I was out of the band, you've got to get this guy in because he's brilliant. He said it's the best Little Richard impression he's ever seen, and it was only later he found out that Brian had appendicitis, which is why he was rolling around screaming.
Brian Johnson's career had hit its uppers, really. He had nowhere really to go, had a great gruff voice that fitted very well into what DC had done and what they wanted to do. But he was also a man who could be very much a part of the band and very much subservient to what Angus and Malcolm Young wanted to achieve. And I think that made him the choice.
AC/DC needed to keep the momentum going in their career because their lead singer had died. Now, for most bands, that would be the end of the band. But somehow Brian Johnson managed to fill Bon Scott's shoes, which is unheard of in rock and roll, totally unheard of. And he actually managed to live up to Bon Scott's name somehow. It's a unique story in music.
What still amazes me to this day is the speed it was done. Bon Scott died on February the 19th, 1980. Brian Johnson was announced that is, officially, on April the 8th, 1980. Less than 7 weeks later.
That's frighteningly quick, you know. And opens them up to potential allegations that they didn't give a shit that Bon was dead, they were going to carry on regardless. Now, I don't believe that for a minute.
It's an interesting question as to whether Brian Johnson was sort of dancing on Bon Scott's grave.
It was surprising the speed with which Bon Scott was replaced in AC/DC. I think it caught a lot of people unawares.
I don't think the fans were ever going to be ready for Bon to be replaced by, by another singer, because Bon was, as much as Angus was the great symbol of AC/DC, you know, he was the front man, and he was just such a hugely popular character.
Bon Scott had such a reputation that for anyone else to replace Bon Scott, I just don't think it would have worked. And it would have looked like a cash-in.
Maybe they threw themselves into the thick of it very quickly just to get over the grief.
The word was that they'd approached Bon Scott's family and said, we want to carry on with the band, and the family had no problem with it.
It was Bon's father who suggested to the band that they should continue without Bon and with a new singer. So I think if you get the blessing from the family, then it's only right that they should continue.
I don't think it was too soon, because AC/DC at that point had just started making headway outside Australia.
AC/DC, they've been together for many years at this point, and it's very much the brothers' band. It's Malcolm and Angus's band. You know, Bon Scott hadn't been the first singer in AC/DC. Originally, he'd started off driving their van for them. You know, he was several years older than them, and initially it was like, well, why would he be joining? So I think it was their band, they decided to get on with it. I don't think it's a mark of disrespect to Bon Scott. You know, they were starting to sell a lot of records, they had a career, was really beginning, and I think they just wanted to get straight back into it again.
In hindsight, of course, it worked, because Brian Johnson came in, they did Back in Black, not just the biggest album of their career, but one of the biggest albums of all time in any genre of music. So it worked.
It was Brian Johnson that took ACDC onto the next level, really, commercially, and they started to make headway outside Australia, which was the key. You're never going to make a career in Australia. And they started to make headway in England, or rather Britain, and in the States. And then they started to explode. So it's interesting, because I can't think of anyone else that could have replaced Bon Scott without looking like a dick.
It has to be said that in a nearly 35-year history, nothing is more controversial as far as ACDC are concerned than Bon Scott's perceived or imagined role with Back in Black.
There is constant debate over lyrics and whether any material was recorded.
A lot of people say that Bon Scott had written the majority of the lyrics, I think, on Back in Black, but the band deny this.
The credits on the album are only for Angus and Malcolm Young, and also I think for Brian Johnson as well. But you do tend to think that some of the lyrics, certain lyrics, stuff like "Have a Drink on Me," maybe what do you do for money, honey? A lot of the time you sometimes think they read more like Bon Scott's lyrics than Brian Johnson's, but they may have just been written by the others in the style of Bon Scott.
Bon was exceptionally funny, very, very witty. He could get away with anything. He could say the most sexist thing, and a lot of women, it'd be like Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy, a lot of women didn't find that offensive when Bon said it, because he was just a charmer. He was, you know, he was a bit of a dirty old git, and I think they liked that with him. And there's a lot of that humour in the lyrics to some of the songs from Back in Black. I mean, Have a Drink on Me, if that was written, I could understand that being written by Bon, but if it was written by Brian as a sort of tip of the hat to Bon, then it's pretty tasteless, really, but quite funny, and maybe Bon would have thought that would be quite funny anyway.
I know that Bon had worked on some lyrics. Now, ACDC themselves have admitted in certain cases some of these were just lines that they used, you know, on built songs around them. You Shook Me All Night Long, obviously, is the one that I know that certain people have seen, or was shown by Bon at the time.
I saw a sheaf of papers on which Bon was scribbling ideas for lyrics for the album that was to be Back in Black. Now, memory can play a few tricks on you, but I'm sure I saw the line, "She told me to come, but I was already there," which is in You Shook Me All Night Long. I'm sure I saw it. And I saw other lines in there which were to turn up on songs from the album. I am not saying Bon wrote all the lyrics. I'm not even saying he wrote close to all the lyrics. I'm saying he had an input.
Maybe it was out of trying to give Brian as good a start in the band as possible to not give Bon any credits on the album, because then if Back in Black comes out and it says Bon Scott on the co-writing credits, it's going to look a bit lame. It's going to look like this new guy is singing Bon stuff. He's really stepping on the legacy a bit there. Maybe it was just decided that even if some money went to the Bon Scott estate, that they would at least make a clean break and call it Brian's album.
Why ACDC have never given him credit, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I suspect it's the closing of the ranks. I suspect they wanted Brian Johnson to be accepted as the man wholly responsible. But even think about the fact on April the 8th, 1980, he was announced as being in the band. The album was finished several weeks later. You're not going to tell me he was mega fast in writing all his lyrics almost off the top of his head. No. I am convinced, and I know Bon had an input.
There's also supposedly tapes around, which you hear about quite often and which various people claim to have heard. And I don't know whether it's true or not. There's definitely some fakes, but stories of Bon Scott doing Back in Black, definitely Back in Black, the title track, maybe one other. I'm not entirely sure.
Those of you who believe there is a Back in Black demo with Bon Scott, turn off right now, because guess what? There is none. And I'll tell you why I know. Because the songs weren't ready. They were very much in an embryonic state. They weren't even close to getting ready to demo songs at the time that Bon died. That's just daft and stupid. The other thing is, think about it logically. 26 years on, do you really, really believe if a demo exists of Bon Scott singing the Back in Black songs, it would have remained undiscovered? Come on. I remember a few months ago, somebody sent me an MP3 of what they claimed, this is it, this is Back in Black, this is Bon Scott singing. And you listen to it, and other people who are ACDC fans have listened to it as well. It's obviously not Bon, and it's obviously not ACDC. It's a covers band. That demo does not exist.
Bon was quite a tidy drummer himself, so he actually demoed a couple of the tracks with him on drums and the rest of the band playing while Phil Rudd was out of the country or something for a while. So there's two tracks there, Have a Drink on Me and Let Me Put My Love Into You, which were demoed with Bon on drums.
I think his shadow very much hangs over that album very, very heavily. But it's not his work.
Brian Johnson's performance on Back in Black is the performance of a lifetime. I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that Brian never sang better than on that album.
Brian Johnson does the greatest vocal performances of his career, bar none. This was his triumph. He sings brilliantly, absolutely amazingly.
What are the reasons for that? Well, Mutt Lange was an incredible producer. He certainly brought the best out of him. And the songs are so strong, melodically they're really strong, and that probably helped Brian to a point.
It combines the raw ferocity of Power Age with a very polished sort of production sound that obviously was much more appealing to the American audience. And within that, Brian sits very comfortably with the rest of the group. He doesn't sound out of place at all. And a lot of that's down to his voice. Because of the tone of the album, that it was a band in mourning, it was a tribute to Bon Scott as such. There's quite an ominous feel to a lot of the music that's on there. And I think that his sort of high-powered, screeching vocals fit that quite well. It adds a sort of razor's edge to the sound of the music.
Mutt Lange will coach a great vocal performance out of you as well. Plus the fact that Brian was no spring chicken when he joined the band, and the older you get, how long can you keep on screeching for? Angus said that Brian sounds like somebody dropped a truck on his foot. So if your own band are saying that about you, which is, perfectly a good description of him.
When you hear Brian Johnson doing stuff like Hell's Bells and Back in Black, it's unmistakably him. And listen to it now, you can't actually imagine Bon Scott singing those songs. I mean, it may have been his songs in the first place. We'll never know.
I don't know how Bon would have approached those songs. Who knows how he would have slightly changed them. That's something we'll never know. Maybe in another lifetime, in another dimension, another timeline, Bon Scott did that album. Where with the Brian Johnson album, and he does a fantastic job. It's his album. Every track on Back in Black is a classic. Every track is a killer. Every track has its own sense of perspective, a sense of belonging, and even the way they actually tracked it, the way they ordered the songs, works superbly. One of the great moments for me is Hell's Bells, though. The opening with the tolling of the bell and the mournful guitar coming in.
Hell's Bells had already been written and recorded before the bell was introduced, the sound of the tolling bell. And they felt they needed something. They knew that it was going to be the album opener. They felt they had this a riff that Angus once described as ominous, and it was a very weird sound for AC/DC, quite sort of moody and mysterious. So they decided they were going to have a tolling bell at the start of this song, obviously. So the first thing they did was they went to somewhere in Leicestershire and tried to record the sound of a bell in a church, one of the finest examples of a bell in a clock tower of a church in England. The only problem was that the bell tower was full of pigeons. Every time they struck the bell, the pigeons flew off, and it was like, so the fluttering wings meant that they couldn't, that was being recorded as well. And then by the time the bell had stopped ringing and they were ready to record it again, of course the pigeons had all landed again, so this is an interminable process of trying to, pigeons holding up the making of the record. So in the end what they did was they enlisted a bell maker to actually make them a bell that they could strike, and the bell maker struck the bell in the studio to record it properly. That was the very bell that Brian Johnson ended up, you know, hitting on stage and then jumping around on stage and all of that. And of course you've got yourself a wonderful set piece then.
I've always had this theory that it's almost Highway to Hell Part 2. Now in Highway to Hell, of course, the title track of the last album with Bon Scott sings about basically going down to hell, or being on the highway to hell. Now if you look at the lyrics for Hell's Bells, it's talking about rolling thunder, pouring rain, coming on like a hurricane, Satan's calling to you. I think in a way this is AC/DC's way of paying tribute to Bon Scott by taking Highway to Hell another step and almost basically saying the guy who was rolling thunder and pouring rain was Bon. He came on like a hurricane. And Satan did call to him, Satan in the wider sense of the term, from beyond the grave, as it were. He was taken from all of us, from ACDC fans, from the band, etc., into a different world. And I think, in a way, that was their tribute to Bon. And what a great way to open the album. Not in what way you'd expect. It wasn't that driving, dirty blues rock riff that ACDC were always known for, and in fact is on that record elsewhere. It's very slow, it builds steadily. And to me, that is the standout track on a great record. If I had to pick one song, that would be it. But every one of them is just a masterpiece.
There's an expression used by Sum 41, the has-been pop punks, and they called their album All Killer No Filler, which is a bit of a misnomer on their behalf, but I would venture to say that that is 10 tracks without, there's not one bad track on Back in Black.
Do you know what they say about Back in Black? All killer, no filler.
It's all killer, no filler.
As they used to say in Kerrang magazine at the time. But the thing is, I think, for me personally, the standout tracks are the title track, Hell's Bells, and I think the great hit single, which was You Shook Me All Night Long. So I think it's a great pop song.
I use the word pop with a small p. You've got pop metal hits like You Shook Me All Night Long and Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, which were, you know, the highest charting singles for the band had at that point. You've got like timeless classics like Back in Black and Hell's Bells on there. And then even the songs that people might say, well, you know, sort of gloss over, What Do You Do for Money, Honey, Let Me Put My Love Into You, Shake a Leg, Give 'Em the Dog a Bone, you know, Have a Drink on Me. These are all, you know, some bands would kill to be able to write songs like that, and they're not filler, they're up there. It's just a consistent run of really, really good songs from start to finish.
It's really difficult to pick out the highlights of Back in Black because I can't actually think of one weak track on the album.
Every song on that record is a masterpiece. Every song has its own personality. Put them together and they could have easily clashed, and people may have said, oh, well, I want to hear tracks 1, 2 and 3, skip the rest. But they work in tandem, they work as a uniform, and they work as a unison, and they work individually. And that's the beauty of Back in Black. Individually brilliant, collectively even greater. Back in Black is an iconic album. It's not just a great album. It's an album that actually transcended its genre, transcended its time. I've always had a theory that in terms of marketing, in terms of talent, in terms of production, in terms of timing, you can take an album to a certain level of success, maybe 3, 4, 5 million sales worldwide. Once you get beyond that, it goes from being a great album into the level of a social phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon. Back in Black is that. It's one of the biggest selling albums of any genre of all time. It transcends everything. It's a remarkable achievement. You're talking about a piece of music that represents a historic moment in time for a band, but crosses into history absolutely. It's the moment when, to paraphrase something from a movie, ACDC stepped out of history and into legend.
And that is a legendary album. And if there's one album AC/DC are to be defined by, strangely, it wouldn't be a Bon Scott era album, it would be Back in Black. Because that album has become more than a record. It's become part of our social phenomenon. That's the measure of AC/DC's achievement on that record. They didn't make an album for rock fans, they made an album for music fans.
Well, Back in Black is now is by far the biggest selling hard rock album in history.
Back in Black has now sold like apparently 20 million copies in America alone. It's a classic album. It endures because I think it appeals to each successive generation of kind of knuckle-headed heavy metal fans, and I count myself as one of those, because there's no discrimination against it. An 18-year-old can come out and still get something out of that album now, listening now to somebody listening to it as an 18-year-old when it came out. The songs are fantastic. There's a lot of fun there. There's pure entertainment, pure escapism, and I think that's why it's endured.
Sometimes for bands, everything comes together at a certain time, and it's almost like the karma is right. Do you know what I mean? Everything was perfect about that record, and quite often, you know, bands will, I mean, hey, most bands are lucky to make one record a tenth as good as that album in their whole lifetime. But I think everything that was good about AC/DC in terms of music and attitude was distilled into that album.
There's a very memorable review by Nick Kent from the NME about Thin Lizzy's Live and Dangerous, in which he calls the album an album made by heroes. But I think if ever an album was made by heroes, it's Back in Black. Coming back after the death of Bon to come out with an album that was the biggest selling album of their career, it was a phenomenal performance from AC/DC, and talk about backs to the wall triumph. I mean, that is the ultimate one. There's never been a story like that. One of the greatest albums ever made by anyone. When people go on about what's the greatest album ever made, people always go, it's the Beatles, the Stones, and of course, they're up there, of course they are. And then people, modern fans, tend to sort of go for things like Radiohead, etc. But I'd say Back in Black, come on. I mean, music's about having fun, and surely that's the best.
Any band that makes a classic, whoever they are, always faces the problem of following it up. I don't care if you're Black Sabbath, you're Led Zeppelin, you're Metallica, the Beach Boys, whoever. When you follow a masterpiece, how do you do it? Well, the answer is you don't follow. For Those About to Rock came out just over a year after Back in Black. And it immediately faced the problem everyone put it up against Back in Black. And when you compare the two, sadly, For Those About to Rock pales. But take it on its own. Take it away from Back in Black, and what have you got? You've got a very good album.
Few bands will release an album as good as Back in Black. Those that do very rarely replicate the success. They were never going to achieve again what they achieved with Back in Black. You know, and For Those About to Rock is the result. It's a very, very good record, but it's just not as good as Back in Black.
What For Those About to Rock did was move them slightly away from the dirtier blues rock of the Bon Scott era. It's Mutt Lange's most polished production with AC/DC. I have a feeling that's why they decided not to work with him again after that, because they didn't like the way he sterilised certain aspects of their performance and cleaned up certain parts of their sound.
Songwriting wise, For Those About to Rock just wasn't as strong. I mean, there's some dogs on that record.
I never thought it was anywhere near as good as Back in Black, and I remember being quite disappointed by it at the time. It felt to me like the songs weren't quite there. But then again, you know, it did give them the title track, which of course became a big kind of set piece in the live show.
We're just a battery for hire, with a gas on fire. Ready and aim, ready you. Break up your balls, load up your can. We're 21, get saloon.
For Those About to Rock, brackets, We Salute You, close brackets, became the sort of the closing number in the set. Because of course on the album it has, when Brian Johnson sings about a 21 gun salute, you get the sound of cannons firing. And of course it didn't take a lot to work out where to go with that. Get some cannons on stage. And the cannons became more high tech as the 80s went along. Donington 81, looking back, cannons were a little bit low, a little bit cheap cannons, you know, a bit sort of pound stretcher versions of cannons. But at the time it was a big noise, explosions, lights, you like that kind of thing. So it worked.
You can imagine Mutt Lange and the band in the studio kind of going, we're going to make this the mother of all rock anthems. I mean, it's a brilliantly hilarious tongue-in-cheek title. It's fantastic, a bit of the old Roman gladiatorial stuff. And to be fair, I mean, it's a phenomenal sounding track. But once you put those cannon sounds on the track itself, it's an absolute no-brainer to go, well, we're going to have the biggest. That has closed ACDC gigs for more than 25 years. It's become now a bittersweet moment for any ACDC fan, because you know that, yes, it's fantastic, they're playing For Those About to Rock, but you know it's like tear in the eye, that's the last track.
By the time that For Those About to Rock hit, ACDC were playing the biggest venues in the world, arenas, stadia, you name it, they were playing it. They headlined Donington in 1981 before 70, 80,000 people. That was the norm for them. They were so big and such a great live draw, they were playing to tens of thousands of people a night. The days of playing theatres were long gone unless they decided to do it as a warm-up. 2,000 to 3,000 people a night, chicken feed now to DC. And they upgraded their stage show accordingly. So you had the big Hell's Bell, you had the cannons roar For Those About to Rock. Stage performance became an important part of what DC were. And I think DC had actually become a different type of live beast, but they were still very effective. That's where they really caught fire on stage.
For Those About to Rock was them getting too much into a big stadium heavy metal band, and it's probably the result of going on tour with Back in Black for so long, playing these enormous American arenas and thinking, well, we're going to fill those places with an absolutely enormous sounding record. But I think they left a bit of the heart and soul out of the music while they were doing that.
Back in 1955, man, you know about the rock and roll show and all that jazz. The white man had the smokes, the black man had the blues. But no one knew what they was gonna do, but you constantly had the news. Saturday night,
To me, Brian never felt comfortable singing Bon Scott era songs. mainly because they're not his, mainly because he was stepping into someone else's shoes, a dead man's shoes if you want. In the same way that Ronnie James Dio, great singer though he is, could never do Ozzy Osbourne era Black Sabbath justice, in the same way that Sammy Hagar, great singer though he is, could never do justice to David Lee Roth era Van Halen, because those songs were tailored to certain people. And I don't think Brian Johnson has ever felt comfortable doing anything from the Bon Scott era, because it doesn't fit. He wasn't the Bon Scott character. However, he became an effective live performer in the way that he presented what he was. And he was a lovable character. He was a jovial man on the street who came on the stage and just entertained. It was Angus who became the focal point as far as the personality of the band was concerned, and also the stage show. And the lighting was impressive, the sound was crystal clear, and AC/DC just drove everything forward. And let's not forget, they have the best rhythm section in the world with Phil Rudd, Cliff Williams and Malcolm Young. That is unbeatable. Phil Rudd was fired by the band during the recording sessions for the Flick of the Switch album. The reasons basically came down to drink and drugs. Rudd couldn't cut it anymore, and therefore they fired him.
He left to, I believe, become a helicopter pilot. He went into aviation, bought a plane or something like this.
Apparently he said that what he did do is he retired to fly aeroplanes in Australia. I don't know whether that's an allusion to something else, but apparently he probably did fly a few aeroplanes.
Now there is a story, they brought in a guy called Barry T. Wilson, who used to be in Procol Harum, to do some of the drumming sessions to complete the album, but never used anything he did. All the drumming apparently on Flick of the Switch was Phil Rudd's. They brought in Simon Wright, who was very much a comparatively unknown English drummer, to replace Rudd.
Simon Wright was, younger, a lot younger than the rest of them, and he'd been in various kind of fair to middling heavy metal bands, groups like Titan and A to Z, who were bands that never did anything. They supported Black Sabbath and bands of that nature, but never really gone anywhere in their own right. So he was, it was a dream, must have been a dream gig for him to have ended up in AC/DC.
But as soon as you replace Phil Rudd, however good Simon Wright was and is as a drummer, he's not AC/DC's drummer.
Well, it depends how honest you want to be about it, but I thought he was bloody awful. It just didn't sound right, to excuse the pun. It just sounded wrong.
Nobody does AC/DC's drumming better than Phil Rudd. So immediately they lost a little bit of what they had before. The greatest rhythm section around, Rudd, Cliff Williams on bass and Malcolm Young on rhythm guitar, was scuppered.
The trick about AC/DC is, although the music sounds simple, it's incredibly difficult to play. And this is where a lot of people don't get this. And this is why, I've got such admiration for them as musicians. It's not easy to play at all. Very, very difficult. Their chord progressions, the beat that they play off is very, very difficult.
Flick of the Switch was a change of direction for AC/DC. They went back and decided to produce themselves, got rid of Mutt Lange, who'd obviously done Highway to Hell, Back in Black, for those about to rock.
Good album, but by that time they ditched Mutt Lange, or Mutt Lange wasn't available, depending on who you believe. There was a great rumour at the time they were doing Flick of the Switch, and every night they were sending tapes across to Mutt Lange from the studio so that he could actually give his opinion. That wasn't true, but I think it showed the impact Mutt Lange had. Those rumours were emanating.
I don't know whether he was doing other things or whether they wanted him to jump ship and get a new sound. I don't really know about that, but I think it probably wasn't their best move at that time, because actually they could have made another great album at that time. I think they still had a couple of great records in them at that point.
I think it was an attempt after For Those About to Rock, which was quite a big production type album, maybe an attempt to go back to a more stripped down sound like they'd had on the albums they'd made with Bon Scott. The trouble is the songs, again, just weren't there. I mean, everything's credited to the Young Brothers and to Brian Johnson, but you look back at the track listing now, and there's very little on there that makes it into the set these days.
The real acid test of Flick of the Switch, of course, is do they still play any songs off it? And the answer is, as with many albums made in the 1980s by ACDC, no.
Flick of the Switch is a much more down-to-earth, limiting album, if you want to put it that way. They went back to basics. The Young Brothers effectively produced it. The songs were quite decent, it had its standout moments, but for the most part, it was the start of a downturn. It was the start of an era when AC/DC were making unsatisfactory albums that really were no more than an excuse to go out and perform live.
They were making money on the road, and I think there was probably a lot less thought was going into their albums. It's all right. You know, if I never heard it again, I wouldn't be too worried. But I think the fact that they changed producers at that point probably wasn't a great idea.
Flick of the Switch is, I would argue that's an underrated album, but a lot of people would say that it's rated about right.
Flick of the Switch, hugely underrated record. It's raw, brutal. It's Brian Johnson's Power Age almost.
There's some fun to be had there. Guns for Hire, and that's a killer track. And if I remember well, they opened at Donington with that in 1984. And it was a moment of tremendous excitement for me and thousands of others.
I don't know why it didn't do so well. It really, I guess because it didn't have a big hit single on it. But I mean, you just listen to tracks like Bedlam in Belgium, which I think is absolutely awesome.
How can you go wrong with a song called that? And they almost went wrong, but I like that. It's somebody once described AC/DC as being moronic brilliance, and I think Bedlam in Belgium is a very good example of that.
Maybe it's a little too raw for mainstream ears, I don't know, but for me it's an absolute corker of a record. But everything was stripped down, even, I mean, the album, it's just a line illustration of Angus hanging off a big power switch. Maybe it was just a little too simple for people's tastes, but for me, Flick of the Switch is a real gem of an album.
Malcolm Young will argue till he's blue in the face that Fly on the Wall is a credible album. That is a dog of an album. I mean, I got it when they were reissued recently, and I got it for free, and I still feel ripped off. I mean, I feel bad that it's taking up. Do you know, the worst thing is I've got to keep it because it's AC/DC. So it's possibly the worst album in my collection.
Fly on the Wall, Light Flicker the Switch, these are the sort of the lost ACDC albums. I mean, someone somewhere will turn around and tell you they're great records. I just don't think they were. And I mean, at the time, you know, the feeling was that the songs weren't there. They didn't have the hits. They just felt like they were going through the motions.
Personally, I don't rate Fly on the Wall, but I don't know many ACDC fans that do. I know one who does, but he's a pervert.
I don't actually know why I like it particularly. I think I like it because it's so ham-fisted. And I have an affection for it because there's almost a naivety about songs like Sink the Pink and Shake Your Foundations and Playing with Girls and even Fly on the Wall itself. And even the cover, which had a big sort of cartoon fly on a wall, looking through a hole in the wall, had a certain sense of On the Buses. It was so dumb and stupid that somehow I became rather attached to it. I don't pretend it's a great album. I fully appreciate and understand why so many AC/DC fans would regard this as the worst album the band have ever done.
Fly on the Wall is the worst album AC/DC have ever made by some distance.
By this time, the success, they were huge. And I think they kind of lost track of where they were and what they were doing and what they were about.
They wrote some really hackneyed riffs, didn't bother trying to sort of weld that to any decent tunes. They knocked it out in what sounds like they knocked it out in 5 minutes. I mean, what a shocking sounding record. It's awful. What's the point in having that album? Because if you're going to play AC/DC, my God, you're not going to play that, are you? You're going to put a good album on.
Why do you throw it in the bin then?
Because I can't bear to leave it. I can't bear to throw it away because it says AC/DC on it, and that's how pathetic we AC/DC fans are.
Who Made Who is not an AC/DC album as such. It's not really even the greatest hit. Some people have tried to describe it, oh, it's a compilation. It's a soundtrack album. What happened was Stephen King, the great horror author, whose favourite band are AC/DC, who bought a radio station in New England and then converted it to playing AC/DC all the time, because that's how much of a fan he is, got the commission to do a movie called Maximum Overdrive. And he had this dream, this vision of getting his favourite band to do the soundtrack. AC/DC agreed.
It had 2 incidental pieces of music, which were just instrumentals, which were basic riffs. I'm sure they kind of like went, what have we got? I'll give them that. It's got a couple of the best known Brian tunes. And strangely, I think it has Sink the Pink on it from Fly on the Wall, which I don't know. And it's got Ride On from Bonds, which is a just sublime piece of blues that a lot of people would be, would think AC/DC incapable of playing. But I mean, what it did have, of course, was the huge hit, Who Made Who.
The title track, Who Made Who, again, it was a pop song. It was a great pop song. It had a good hook to it. It's a little bit more of a modern sound. They definitely some sort of attempt to move with the times. But the track itself, it was a catchy song, so people remembered it. It had quite a powerful video with it, and it worked. There was some sense you felt that they were getting themselves back on the right track again.
Both Chase the Ace and DT, the instrumentals, stand up very well. They're very good in their own right. And Who Made Who as a song is an AC/DC classic. It's one of the strongest songs they've ever written during the Brian Johnson era. So no, it's not a compilation. It's not a greatest hits. It's not a new album. It's a soundtrack album.
Blow Up Video is a very disappointing AC/DC album. It's probably second only to Fly on the Wall as the worst AC/DC album. It didn't sound so bad at the time. I think, personally speaking, that was the first time I'd interviewed Angus Young. So, of course, I got very excited and probably played the album more due to the thrill of meeting my hero than actually thinking the record was any good.
Blow Up Your Video was the end of an era because this was the last album that Simon Wright was to be drumming on, and also the last album Brian Johnson wrote any lyrics for, before we moved into the Angus and Malcolm Young era of writing all the songs. There are moments on Blow Up Your Video which are quite good. Heatseeker's a very strong song.
Blow Up Your Video was very much a return to form on the back of Fly on the Wall. It's not a great AC/DC album by a long shot, but Heatseeker was an enormous hit. It's quite a good record. Terrible sleeve, awful album sleeve, I think.
Again, it suffers from the same problems AC/DC tended to be in at the time in the 80s, in a rut, whereby they had a couple of good songs on a record. The rest of it was fairly mundane and ordinary, and no one really cared.
How many AC/DC fans can sing 4 out of 5? Can sing 4 or 5 tracks off that album? No one can. I bet you AC/DC don't even know how they go. Shit.
There was a period after sort of Blow Up Your Video and before The Razor's Edge, which was a bit of an unstable time for AC/DC. I mean, Simon Wright left and was replaced by Chris Slade, who was a very well-respected session drummer. He'd been in Manfred Mann's Earth Band and Uriah Heep, but I think he was known better as a session guy. But there's also the period where, around this time, Malcolm Young had to sort of step off a tour. He basically sat out an AC/DC tour, supposedly due to booze problems.
To everybody's surprise, except maybe people on the inside, he had a serious alcohol problem. He had to stop touring, and they got in their cousin, Stevie Young, who'd been in a band called the Starjets way back in the early 80s, a very AC/DC style of band, to replace him for part of their American tour. Malcolm literally had to leave the band in order to clean out. That's how bad things had got. And I think a lot of people were quite amazed to see the fact that Malcolm Young had an alcohol problem, let alone the fact that AC/DC were admitting he had an alcohol problem. So they had all these things going on. And I think there may have been a stage at that point where people wondered, are AC/DC going to carry on?
AC/DC did rally around the time Chris Slade came in and made what is their best album of a pretty troubled second half of the 80s, which is The Razor's Edge, which, okay, their best album, it's only got 3 good tracks on it, but there's still 3 tracks that are much better than anything else that came after For Those About to Rock.
The Razor's Edge is the first example of an AC/DC album with too many songs on it. And when it's good, it's brilliant. And when it's bad, it's shit.
I think Razor's Edge is a bit of a disappointment. I really don't like the album. I think the problem with Razor's Edge is it doesn't actually focus itself at any point. It has moments when it nearly cuts through Razor's Edge, sorry, bad pun. But to me, it's another one of those plodding albums that people just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, okay, whatever, next.
The Razor's Edge was AC/DC's comeback album, if you like. I mean, they got Bruce Fairbairn in to produce it. He produced Bon Jovi and Aerosmith.
Good producer, but I mean, you don't really want AC/DC working with somebody who works with Aerosmith and Bon Jovi.
Bruce Fairbairn, his production, I mean, he's known for the more commercial end of the rock. So he came as a surprise when it was announced that he was going to do The Razor's Edge. Didn't know quite how it was going to work.
The sound can never change. They never do. They're not going to get keyboards in or start doing ballads. You know, an AC/DC song has to fulfil certain criteria, so it makes it quite restrictive. So I think what they do is they do get a producer in, different producers every so often, just to try and bring something new to the table.
It's the most commercial sounding AC/DC album ever, but it's not throwaway commercial. Because I mean, it got them right back to the top of the charts. It worked. It was a gamble that worked.
Their band just sounded a little bit more vital than they had done for a while, a little bit more alive. It was a fresher sound. And again, great hooks, great choruses, the riffs were there. Again, the band sounded like a little bit more rejuvenated.
Give me that blues.
reality that the live, AC/DC live album is probably the best they could do.
Well, the AC/DC Live, the Imagine If You titled Live album, came out in '92. I'm surprised they hadn't done that sooner, because it was a perfect document for Brian Johnson's time in the band.
Live is a worthy album. I mean, it sums up what an AC/DC show was like with Brian, and so that's all good. But obviously, it's inevitably compared to If You Want Blood, which is one of the greatest live albums ever released.
It's not comparable to If You Want Blood because Bon Scott's not there. And If You Want Blood is a magical live album. It's my favourite live album. I think it's absolutely astounding. They could never match that. They were playing to bigger audiences for the AC/DC live album as compared to If You Want Blood, and it's a longer record. And it's got its great moments. Most of the great moments come from the early part of the Brian Johnson era, those songs. But it's a very good performance. It's what AC/DC do best, which is still they perform very well live. So it comes across rather well.
Their big forte was always on stage, ultimately, and the best AC/DC records were the ones that captured the essence of what they were on stage anyway. So any AC/DC live album is always going to be good.
For me as a fan, it's nowhere near as good as If You Want Blood, because it sounds like a younger, fresher band than the Bon Scott years. Also, you only had two sides of vinyl. You didn't necessarily get the whole concert, so you just had the kind of edited highlights. And also, listening to Johnson doing the Bon Scott, some of the Bon Scott numbers, especially things like Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap and TNT, you do realise that he does, to be honest, sound a little uncomfortable at that stage. And you can't really blame him, because he'd been in the band at that point for over 10 years. And he was still singing the Dead Guys songs, and probably felt that, why was he still doing it? He's expected to do it, but you realise even now you still couldn't help compare his performance to Bon Scott's.
AC/DC are still one of the biggest rock bands in the world. They have kept a very, very big audience. And not just that, like the Rolling Stones, they crossed over from just hard rock fans or rock fans into fans in general. People who are not necessarily fans of rock music will go and see AC/DC because it's a great night out, because they know what they're going to get. And that's also one of the secrets of AC/DC. You know what you're going to get. No surprises, no fillers, straight ahead, down the line, classic rock and roll. From a band who deliver it better than almost anyone else in the world.
They are just a killer live band. But you just know that. I always wanted to take my brother to see them because he loved things like James Brown. And I always feel that James Brown, the way he used to relentlessly drive home the funk, that is so like AC/DC with the rock. That is just, they are just a, there's no bullshit with AC/DC.
They're up there with the all-time greats. And even though it can be said they're not what they were, you know with AC/DC, you put them on the bill, they're going to sell out. I think AC/DC had always wanted Phil Rudd back. I think when they fired him back in 82, 83, during the Flick of the Switch sessions, it wasn't, that's it, you're out, you're never coming back. I think they always knew he was the guy for the band, but had to wait for the right time. They had to know he'd clean himself out. They had to know he could give 100% again. And when it was obvious he was ready, there was no choice. It was a no-brainer. Sorry, Chris Slade's a great drummer. He's not an ACDC drummer. Neither was Simon Wright. Time for Phil Rudd to return behind the stool. Time for the only man who should ever drum for ACDC to be back behind the kit.
If Phil Rudd says he's ready to come back, then Chris Slade has to go. It's that simple. You can't just go, well, sorry, Phil, you left the band. Well, because Phil Rudd is the drummer in ACDC, and he's the only drummer that the fans want. And that's tough on Chris Slade, because Chris Slade is a fantastic drummer. You don't play in a band with Paul Rodgers and Jimmy Page if you're a useless drummer. And in fairness to anyone, in fairness to Simon Wright and Chris Slade, it was never going to be the same with somebody else behind that drum stool.
The story was that Malcolm Young had gone to see ACDC while he was having his kind of drink-free sabbatical, had gone to one of the gigs. And I remember interviewing Malcolm in the very early 90s, and he basically came away from the gig and said, well, it's interesting, first time he'd seen an ACDC show, but basically that drummer has to go. And you know, you listen to the drummer, Chris Slade's a fantastic drummer, but the drummer for ACDC will always be Phil Rudd.
The power was back. And it's strange to think about Simon Wright and Chris Slade as not having the power. They do, they can bash as hard as anybody. What I mean by power is the real focus of energy. Suddenly, AC/DC had that sensibility, they had that groove and rhythm again, which perhaps they'd missed over the last nearly a decade in the absence of Rudd. It was back.
Woo! Machines kept the monitor clean. Was the best damn woman that I ever seen. She had a cycle size, telling me no lies, knocking me out with those American thighs, taking my little share and me fighting for air. She told me to come, but I was already there, and the walls started shaking, earth was quaking, my mind was aching. We might make it in a year. Should be all night long. Yeah, you should be all night long.
There's just something about Phil Rudd's playing, he locks into that, so without getting all muso and technical about it, he locks into that sort of rhythm section with Malcolm and with Cliff Williams, and it just works. It's like a machine, sounds like a machine, it's fantastic. And when you saw Phil Rudd back touring with AC/DC, it put a smile on his face. It was funny to see because he was just he's so the perfect drummer.
The guy just never plays any fills, really. He never plays any sort of fancy stuff. He just drives it home. It's just perfect. He's just rhythmically so solid. He is the I would say, could be the greatest rock drummer of all time.
Getting Rick Rubin to produce Ballbreaker in 1995, I think it was quite an inspired choice because he'd obviously done a lot of stuff with the Beastie Boys and so on. He was a hip producer, he was a hip name to drop.
Rick Rubin always wanted to work with AC/DC. It was one of his dreams, going way back to the 80s. I remember the first time I met Rick, this is about mid-80s, 85, and he always said that his ultimate band was AC/DC. That's the band he wanted to work with. So he finally got the opportunity to work with his heroes.
Anyone who's followed Rick Rubin's career would know that he would have been dying to produce AC/DC, and it would have been an absolute dream come true. When they finally went, okay, we'll do an album with you, there's no doubt about it, AC/DC needed a good producer, and I still think they always do need a good producer.
I'm not a big fan of Rick Rubin's production, to be honest. I think Electric by the Cult is the worst sounding album that they've ever released.
I am convinced he did the Cult's Electric album because he wanted to do an AC/DC style album almost as a demo to show them what he could do, and finally got his wish. And it has to be said, he did a very good job.
I think Ballbreaker's quite a good album, actually, and I think Rick Rubin does bring something. He brings his own thing into it, whatever album he's working on, whatever artist he's working on, whether that's AC/DC or Johnny Cash, he brings his own thing.
What Rick Rubin did is basically what Rick Rubin does best, and that is stand back, let the band sort it out, and to get the sounds that they wanted.
I don't think, in all honesty, he did a great deal. I think he was probably delighted to be asked to work on an AC/DC album and was a huge AC/DC fan, but he didn't do very much at all.
Rick Rubin obviously knows what rock is all about, and I would say that was very much a return to form, a late sort of Indian summer. It was great to see them making a record that everybody liked as much as that. I think it's the best album since For Those About to Rock.
The passion was back. You could feel that they were flowing again. You can feel the blues rock, dirty riffs were getting back in groove. You can actually sense that they wanted to make music again. And I think a lot of the 80s was spent making records because, well, that's what we better do because we don't know what else to do. Suddenly with Ballbreaker, with a producer in there who understood them and wanted to work with them and was a big fan, it brought out something from them again.
I think that Rick Rubin got a lot out of them, but I bet he was nervous when he was recording with them, because I'm sure you don't really tell Malcolm Young how to sort of get a guitar sound, or Phil Rudd how to, do you want to play to a click track? I think Phil Rudd would probably break a snare drum over your head if you said that to him. And I think even someone as famous, successful and fated as Rick Rubin, I bet he had a little queasy feeling in the pit of his stomach the first day at the office on that one.
Ladies and gentlemen, ACDC.
Well, I was out on the drive on a bit of a trip, looking for thrills to give me some kicks. Now I want you ladies, I shoot from the hip. I was born with a stiff upper lip. Looking down in hell, right bad in the fire. And I'm digging down, and I'm about your thing. I keep a stiff upper lip, and I shoot from the hip. I keep a stiff upper lip, and I shoot from the hip. Yes, I do.
I must admit, when I heard Stiff Upper Lip, which came out in 2000, it took me by surprise because it was exciting. There are fillers on the record. Again, you have the problem, Stiff Upper Lip itself and Safe in New York City are both very strong tracks. Other tracks aren't so hot. But what amazed me was that AC/DC sounded excited again. Excitable. They really seemed to be enjoying themselves. There's almost a smile on the tracks. And it was for the first time since For Those About to Rock, you really felt that they wanted to make an album. Ballbreaker got them back in that direction. You could hear the beginnings of that with Ballbreaker. But after a near 6-year gap, suddenly AC/DC went to the studio, did Stiff Upper Lip, and it sounded like they wanted to make a record.
Stiff Upper Lip was a big comeback album for AC/DC, but I don't think this is necessarily anything to do with the quality of the record. I mean, it's to do with the fact that I think by that stage, people generally, rock music fans, were a little less blinkered about stuff generally, and people suddenly realised AC/DC were a good time band, they were a fun band, and particularly a great live band.
Records for AC/DC these days are a means of telling the world that they're going to go on tour. That's as simple as that. The world isn't waiting for the next AC/DC album and hasn't been for 25 years.
That was the reason that album sold, that was the reason the tour worked really well. A lot of people who possibly ignored, a lot of rock fans who maybe ignored them, woke up to that fact and went along to see them. Again, the credibility of doing an album with Rick Rubin had helped that along. They were getting written about more, there were loads of magazines writing about them and so on. And, again, they became quite briefly quite a fashionable band.
AC/DC are still one of the biggest rock bands in the world. They'll release an album again soon. They'll go on a world tour. They'll fill out every arena, every stadium they play. That's a given.
I think they can pretty much do what they want. I mean, whether they're ever going to go down the road of announcing a farewell tour or whether they'll just disappear quietly. But I'd say they've still got another few years in them if they wanted it.
Why are we talking about this stuff 25 years, 20 years after their heyday? It's because they're better at it than everyone else. They're the ultimate heavy rock band.
Yeah!